Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unlocking Fitness podcast. Today I have with me Anita Griggs, and Anita is a CIMSPA chartered activity and health practitioner. She's had over 30 years experience of working in the fitness, leisure and health industry, and she specialises in working with older adults and people with long-term health conditions. And part of that has been the introduction to the idea of scope of practice, to help coaches and personal trainers and people like that to stay within their guidelines so that they're not teaching people that they're not certified to teach, and making sure that everybody stays safe as possible. She works predominantly, but is not limited to, cardiac disease and cancer, which obviously has quite severe implications. And she has a passion for ensuring everyone has access to good quality evidence-based physical activity opportunities. And because of that, she founded the company Vista Wellbeing in 2017, which is a not-for-profit organisation that provides affordable, individually tailored and socially based exercise sessions within the North Devon area and online. So today we're going to be talking about scope of practice, which is a huge topic, and it's really hard to stay within one train of thought. So we tried very, very hard to keep this in a conversation that you would enjoy listening to. So I hope you do, and let's dive in. So welcome everyone to another episode of the Unlocking Fitness podcast. Today I have with me Anita Griggs, and we're going to tackle the subject of scope of practice. So welcome, Anita.
Hello, thanks for having me, Sarah.
It's absolute pleasure. I'm sure we're not really going to come up with many answers today, but it's always interesting to have the kinds of conversations we have been having recently. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about how you came to be so passionate about the scope of practice topic?
Yes. I had to really think about this question. I think it's always been on my radar. I'm a fitness instructor of 30 years and more experience. And I came to the industry at a time when suddenly it became quite important that people actually had a qualification.
Yes.
And up until then, anybody could do anything. And actually, a whole another conversation is that they still can do. But
yes. We'll put a pin in that for now.
Yeah, absolutely. But I was working as a receptionist at a local authority leisure centre, and the local authority had said, well, we think all our instructors should be qualified now. And the instructors actually said, well, why? We've been teaching for years, why should we? And they found themselves in this difficult situation whereby their instructors were refusing to be qualified. And they said, do you fancy doing a qualification? Because I always quite liked going to the classes. And I said, oh, yeah, why not? So I did. But so it was on the radar. I don't think I knew that that's what it was called at that point. But this awareness that actually having some standards to adhere to was a good idea. And that's been with me then ever since then. That was 1989. Became very much more apparent when I started to get into working with people with health conditions, because the consequences became much more apparent, or the potential ones of not staying in scope.
Yeah, so what kind of area of health conditions do you work in?
Okay. I work with cardiac disease, particularly. Okay. So I do have a contract with the local NHS trust to deliver on cardiac rehabilitation. But I also have a community interest company, and we work with people with cancer rehabilitation, falls prevention, frail elders, as well as what would perceive to be lower risk health conditions, asthma, arthritis,
Yeah. Cool.
high blood
So you're,
pressure, things
yeah,
like
yeah.
that.
So you're working with really kind of sensitive, I think, populations, you know, where your actions have consequences and your lack of action also has consequences. So
Yes.
can you kind of explain a little bit what we mean by scope of practice? Because it's kind of one of them words that's just, or there's phrases that's just bandied about all the time, and people go, oh, yeah, yeah, like they know what they're talking about. And then it doesn't really mean anything to anybody. So since you've been
No.
working with it for so long, what does it mean to you?
I've tried to summarize it because, as you know, you asked me this question before today, and I thought, oh, I've really got to come up with something here. And I think it is doing what you know and not doing something if you feel that you don't really know what you're doing. But also scope of practice can identify procedures, actions, and processes that individual is permitted to perform.
Yeah, that word. Yeah. I think there's a huge difference there, isn't there, between thinking that you know something and doing something that you're allowed to do within your insurance terms or within your qualifications or whatever, because there's so much information out there at the moment, isn't there, on the internet and all the rest of it, that, you know, as sports coaches and fitness instructors and personal trainers, we can literally go and learn anything.
Yes.
You know, but that doesn't mean that it's within our scope of practice to do that just because we read it somewhere, you know.
No, absolutely. You know, I think scope of practice, an individual scope of practice, is based on specific education and experiences. You know, so I think it's important to bring in experience to that. But most importantly, demonstrated competence.
Yes. Yeah, which, you know, the qualifications you would hope test.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's another conversation.
Just, yeah. We'll try not to veer off topic here, though.
Absolutely, absolutely. But yeah, it should be your experience and as well as your qualification, because I always think in terms of when you gain a qualification, that's like passing your driving test. Doesn't make you a good driver.
No. No, absolutely. In fact, it's quite terrifying when you pass your test and you're so used to somebody sat there telling you what to do that when they're not there anymore, it's like, oh, heck, what do I do now?
Yeah,
you know,
I've got to make my own decisions here.
Yeah, it's like all of a sudden you've forgotten how to drive, you know.
Absolutely. And I also I have a saying, and I can't remember who I pinched it from, but it will be somebody important and very knowledgeable, that you don't know what you don't know until you know that you don't know it. And that can itself raise a lot of issues, really, in terms of, you know, not just doing what you're allowed to do within your job, assuming you're employed by somebody, but knowing why you're doing it.
Yeah.
And if you, and this comes back to, if you don't really know what you're doing, then just don't do it. But it's hard, isn't it? It's hard for people if they're in a job role and they're being told to do something and they're uncomfortable with that, to speak up sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? I think fitness instructors, personal trainers, sports coaches, we've got some of the hardest jobs, really, because you're taught on your like basic level qualification, you're taught what to teach.
Yes.
You don't really learn how to apply it to different populations of people. And then you're thrown in at the deep end and going, off you go, you're qualified now, let's go coach somebody. And that person could have real serious condition. They could have an underlying problem that they don't even know about, that, you know, you're not expected to know about if they don't.
No.
You know, they could have had loads of injury problems. They could be suffering with anxiety, with a stressful life, or whatever it is. You know, they could range from 10 to 80, you know, and all of a sudden you're just put in front of these people and expected to be able to do it. And I think that's really hard, because that the scope of practice conversation is never had with newly qualified people. So we're not, you know, they're just taught what to teach.
Absolutely. And I think often managers don't understand their scope either. So you've got a double whammy. You've got somebody in charge of a leisure centre, for instance, who just needs to get classes and sessions covered.
Yeah.
And to them, a fitness instructor is a fitness instructor. And are they going to necessarily recognise the difference between somebody who's trained, thinking in terms of the fitness industry, somebody who's done a step aerobics qualification compared to somebody who's got a gym qualification? You know, they don't always know that. And you know, and recognizing that if you've got a gym qualification, that is for teaching in a gym. It's not for teaching in a care home.
No. Yeah.
You know, that's for teaching in a gym.
Yeah, it's so difficult, isn't it? You know, because as individuals, you know, teachers, trainers, coaches, we're all really, really helpful people. You know, we don't go into coaching for the money. We go in it because we want to help people, or we have a passion for sport and fitness and we want to help other people get the same passion we have. So, you know, it's difficult to tell those kinds of people, hey, hang on a minute, you can't help.
It is.
But, you know, sometimes we just have to, because it's better for the individual that they're trying to coach or teach or train. You know, it's safer for everybody all around just to say, look, hang on a minute, this isn't my bag. I don't know how to do this properly. I'll find somebody who does. That in itself can be a lot more helpful to an individual, rather than trying to blag your way through it and hoping nobody will notice you don't really know what you're doing.
Absolutely. And better for your reputation, I think, as well.
Yeah.
So actually being able to understand where your knowledge and skills and expertise is, to understand your own personal scope of practice, and then actually having the confidence to say, do you know what? I'm not the best person for this.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is where it's really important, you know, in the marketing world, in the business world, especially online, they're always saying, you know, really understand who is your ideal customer. And in a way, that applies so strongly to scope of practice, because when trainers and coaches really focus on a very small group of people and focus really heavily on those people, they very rarely get drawn outside of their scope of practice, because they're the same population of people. You know, if they're men who want to train for their first Ironman, and they're over 50, you know, you know that group inside out. You know what problems they're likely to have, and you know the experts that you can go and lean on to help those individuals with those kinds of problems. But if you're a personal trainer or you're a sports coach who's just been thrown in, and, you know, get as many clients as you can, you know, you work in this gym, and you know, you're allowed to talk to anybody, just build your business yourself. It's like, hang on a minute, how do I do that?
Absolutely. And if they do go and talk and offer their services to anybody, then they run a risk of, at some point, whether it's knowingly or unknowingly, working outside of their own scope of practice.
Yeah, I mean, you see it all the time, especially with injuries, seen as obviously that's my area. It's that whole trap, really, and I call it a trap because it is, of coaches trying to be helpful and offering advice to people who've just said to them, oh, I've got a bit of an achy shoulder or my back's hurting a bit today. And they go, oh, well, try this because this worked for me, or this worked for somebody else that I was training, you know? And if injuries are not your thing, then it's the intention of trying to fix the pain or solve the pain problem that is outside of your scope of practice.
Absolutely.
You know, and people don't realize that just that little suggestion or just that little bit of advice that, you know, oh, well, it worked for somebody else, so maybe it'll help you, is actually quite dangerous.
Potentially, absolutely. Very much so. You know.
So, go on.
No, you carry on.
I was just going to say, kind of following that train of thought, in your experience, why is it really important to recognize your coaching limits? Like, what are the consequences of not sticking to those limits?
That's it. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because yes, the potential consequences is somebody could die. That's your worst case scenario. Is somebody could die. In reality, that's very unlikely to be the case. But there's a sliding scale, isn't there, from somebody could die upwards to they might become injured. But actually, I think one of the most important consequences and the things that happen most often is that client's experience is then not successful.
Yes.
Okay, so they do not succeed with their goals because they're not working with the right person to help them to get to their goals. And that can put somebody off physical activity completely.
That's true.
Absolutely, for life. And there within that can bring a whole other load of problems that are more difficult to measure.
Yeah.
So there's your client consequences. You know, whereas it might say, oh, well, they didn't come back, might not seem a dreadful thing to have happened. But actually, I think if a client doesn't come back, we should all ask ourselves, well, why didn't that happen? And, you know, we're not always going to get clients to come back to us because it might just be that we're not the right personality. But we need to reflect because we all have a responsibility to support people to be active in whatever way they choose and to provide a successful experience for them, an enjoyable experience, a successful experience, not an experience where they can't walk for the next week. Not that. And yes, people can die, but that very rarely happens, luckily. But on a day-to-day basis, people leave sport fitness sessions never, ever to return because they've not been looked after properly.
Yeah, and it's not really baked in, is it, as part of personal training practice, particularly, to reflect on your session and how you think it went and what feedback you got from your client. And, you know, and unfortunately, in that situation, if somebody just doesn't continue with you, you never find out why.
No.
You know, even if you try and ring them, they don't answer the phone, or they make up some excuse about I haven't got time anymore, or I can't afford it anymore, or something like that. They don't want to tell you that it was you, or it was something you did, or it was how they felt, you know, which means that the trainer never learns. You know, they can never improve on the problem because nobody ever addressed it.
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
is a shame.
And that's quite a skill, isn't it, to get to a point where you can have open and honest conversations with your clients about how a session went. Did you like that bit or did you not? You've got to have a certain amount of confidence to be asking those questions. I mean, the assessments it's embedded in, isn't it? It's embedded into their competencies to get feedback and reflect, but it's almost like it's tagged on at the end. And
and I think there's a huge element of fear when it comes to personal training in particular. One, new personal trainers worry that they're not good enough. Maybe they think they've started too late and everybody else is better than them. Maybe they're in a gym where there's other trainers involved, and it's, if you're frightened of somebody rejecting you or somebody telling you you're not great, you're not going to ask them, how did that go?
No.
Or if you do, you'll ask it in a way that makes the client feel like they've got to go, yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
you don't really get a proper answer, do you?
Yeah. And then, the other thing is obviously what you're insured to do, and the consequences that if somebody does make a claim.
Yeah.
That if your insurance doesn't cover you, because you've stepped outside of scope of practice, then from a point of protecting yourself, you need to stay within scope of practice. But just because you're insured for something doesn't mean you should do it if you don't feel that you know what you're doing when you're doing it.
No, this is true. Yeah, I've come across that a lot. Just because you can doesn't mean say you should.
Yes.
I've been burned a lot of times by other people doing what they think they can do, but it doesn't mean to say they're great at it, or because they're just trying to help. And it doesn't help in the long run, does it?
No.
You end up in a worse situation. It's like somebody who, I don't know, if they're trying to change your garden or something like that, and oh yeah, I can do that. Yeah. Well, I'm quite interested in gardening. They come and do a really bad job, and a professional, then it costs somebody more than to get the professional in to fix the problem than it does, to have paid them to do it in the first place. So sometimes helping can be more detrimental.
Yes. Yeah. And I think coaches and fitness instructors are often put on the spot in an employed situation, whether asked to cover for somebody else's session. And that can be a tricky one, isn't it? Because it's your job. You've got a manager who's telling you to do that, but maybe that's not your bag, and not what is. You might have done a qualification, but if you're then not interested in that element, you're unlikely to be very good at it.
No. I mean, I did a hockey coaching qualification in 1996. It was my level 1. I'd never played hockey in my life, didn't understand a word of it. I don't know how the hell I passed the qualification, but I did. If somebody asked me to go and coach hockey now, I'd be like, I have no idea what I'm doing.
You just stole one of my analogies there, because I have a similar experience of being a trampoline coach.
Ah, yes.
So yeah, went on a coaching course because I quite like trampolining. But on that coaching course, this is years and years and years ago, I found out really how dangerous it was, and it completely freaked me out. And at that point, I thought, no, I can't ever coach trampolining. I cannot, and I will not do this. But I could, but I absolutely would not be the right person to do it. And it's a bit ironic now that I'm working with people with cardiovascular disease, and people I talk to say, oh, that must be quite scary. No, but that's because I have the knowledge and the competence and the experience to understand and justify what I am doing with every patient I work with.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, isn't it? Being able to justify, understand why you have chosen to do what you're doing with the person in front of you or the people in front of you.
Yeah.
From a benefiting them point of view, not I saw it on YouTube, or I've been to a few yoga classes, or I read it in a book point of view.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a really complicated topic, and it's so huge that it's really impossible to draw any conclusions at all. So do you see any where the future is going, or where the future ought to be with this scope of practice conundrum?
I have always been, ever since it was muted many, many years ago, a bit of a fan of actually getting some formal registration within our industry. Certainly since I've worked within the NHS, clinical professionals don't have a problem with scope of practice. They know what they can do and what they can't do.
Yeah.
They know it. And they stay within it.
Yeah.
And if they don't, they get into trouble for it. And this has been, certainly in the fitness industry, early 2000s, late last century, perhaps muted, that reps were going to bring in a registration process. And now they've been taken over by CIMSPA, and who are trying to do the same. But the public don't know. No. And until the public, who are our patients, our clients, until they actually know that a personal trainer doesn't actually have to be qualified to call themselves a personal trainer, we're not going to move forward, are we? Because there will always be people who will call themselves something that they're not. And you will always have people like that. And, people who give diet advice when they're not a nutritionist or a dietitian. And that happens a lot within personal training. The stepping out of scope of practice for giving nutrition and diet advice. But the public don't know that.
No.
The public don't know. So at the moment, we've got people like me and many others who maintain continual professional development because we enjoy learning, and you can never know it all. And there's always things to learn. And exercise science is a fairly new science. So there is always new evidence coming out that needs to be absorbed and applied. But until there's a real recognition by the public that actually somebody, you can ask whether somebody's got qualifications, you can ask about that person. Until we have a culture of checking who we're working with, I don't think the professional is going to be accountable, because there's too many people who don't want to be accountable.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and there are some people doing some really great work in the industry to try and bring about change. It's just not easy change to bring about.
Totally. There's loads of people that are doing really, really good work. I don't want to sound as if I think the industry isn't doing good work, but the public don't know.
No.
Health professionals don't know. GPs don't know.
Yeah. And I think
that's
part
really
of that
tricky.
Yeah. I think part of that comes from the fact that the trainers themselves don't know.
Quite possibly.
And it annoys me, and it has annoyed me intensely for a long time, that the fitness industry seems to be trying to live up to the medical professional. It's almost like we feel as an industry like the medical professionals look down their noses at us, and we've got to know what they know in order to be good enough. But actually, when we stand in our strengths of communicating with people and helping people with exercise and diet and all that rest of it that goes with it, then actually we are equally as powerful. And when we connect with the medical professionals in our strengths, that's when we can start moving forwards. Because when we recognize what our strengths are, and as an industry, and we just admit, okay, we are not, I don't know, let's say injuries for an example, because that's what I know. We're not trying to treat injuries. That's not what we do as coaches. This is not our bag. Let it go.
Absolutely.
Stand in our strength.
Yeah. Yeah, and I often sort of compare sort of specialist exercise instructors, say, for instance, with with a physiotherapist, and they are excellent at assessment, really good at assessment. That is totally their bag. They're excellent at getting to the crux of what the problem is. But within their training, they're not used to managing long-term relationships with patients. They're certainly not given a lot of training around delivering group exercise. And applying that assessment. And that's come out of conversations that I've had with physios that I have professional relationships with. I respect where their power is, and they respect my skills as well. And that's kind of where we need to be, isn't it? And like you say, standing in our strengths. But we only know what our strengths is if we know what our scope of practice is. Exactly.
Yeah. It's so, we could talk about this for hours. So that seemed like a really good stopping point. Where can people find out more about you and what you do?
More about me and what I do. You could follow Vista Wellbeing, community interest company. My CIMSPA profile page, if you want to know a bit more about my qualifications. Follow Vista Wellbeing on social media. We're on the main channels.
Cool. I'll put those links in the show notes for anybody who wants to follow along.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for the conversation today. It's been so much fun. And like I said, we could have gone on for hours down many, many different rabbit holes. But it's been really interesting to talk to you. Thanks for your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Sarah. It's been great.
The Unlocking Fitness podcast is a Most Motion original, hosted by me, Sarah Pitts. It's based on the Unlocking Fitness book series, which you can get from unlockingfitness.com. At the time of recording, book 1 in the series is available, with books 2 to 5 in the pipeline. You can find more Most Motion at mostmotion.com and on Facebook at Most Motion.